It's 1994, and the video game Rockstar Studio, is still riding high on the success of its overnight sensation, Doom, and its recently released sequel. Doom isn't just a best-selling, critically acclaimed darling, it's a straight-up phenomenon. Spearheaded by the formidable force that are the creative mastermind of John Romero and the programming prowess of John Carmack, it felt like they were unstoppable. But, as time will tell, a talented studio is only part of the equation. But it will be their personal shortcomings, to prove that these gaming gods were merely human after all, that nearly brought it to a fall. Quake, their follow-up project, was supposed to be their magnum opus, but the dreaded feature creep and an uncharacteristically troubled development of John Carmack's new engine led to it being drastically downsized in scope. Not to mention the tension that was growing between its members as it turned into Ego, a company that was just at their highest high, but saw that overwhelming success lead to what was their lowest point in their history. And it was at their lowest that they created not a flop nor a critical disaster, but what is considered today to be a seminal, well-remembered release of theirs. At their lowest, it created Quake. After the success of Doom, John Romero, the creative motor behind it, started taking things more easy. Now, John did not consider himself a lazy man. He just felt that after all the hard work and endless crunch of the last years, he deserved to enjoy the riches that came from its success. After all, the studio has come quite far since the days when they consisted of merely 5 heads. It already had a multitude of talent working for them, recruited from Doom's vibrant modding scene. They still needed Romero for leadership and guidance, but he could still do all that whilst enjoying his new life with his family, his newfound riches, and most importantly, his love for deathmatching with his fans. John Carmack, on the other hand, as always, was hyper-focused on programming the next iteration of id Tech. He didn't have time for the fancies that Romero enjoyed. He only thought about it and its next game. Not because he was such a savvy businessman trying to lead his company to the next success, but because of the simple reason that programming was one of the few things he cared about. Just like the fast cars he loved so much, his mind was always racing. It never stood still, and with a mind like his, it would have been a waste for it to stand still. But that wasn't the reason why he was always busy. He needed it, to think about the next project, so he could challenge himself once again. And it's this clashing of opposing attitudes that led to the first cracks that began to form between the two Johns. And it was these cracks that ran all the way throughout the foundations of it, dividing the whole team in the process. The machine was broken now that its 2 main components didn't run in sync anymore. Quake was an ambitious project. Not only did Carmack envision its engine as the world's arguably first fully polygonal 3D engine that would be fast enough for its trademark snappy action games, but it was also to bolster a persistent online world. Inspired by his fascination for William Gibson's cyberspace and Neil Stephenson's metaverse, it was supposed to be kind of akin to what would later be known as an MMO or massively multiplayer online game. And while Quake eventually did define what online multiplayer was going to be from then on, the persistent part, however, was nowhere to be found. That role was later to be filled in by Richard Garriott's dream project and culmination of 16 years of games in the Ultima universe. And that was Ultima Online in 1997. But albeit being the most ambitious aspect of the game to be axed, it was far from the only casualty. To Romero's dismay, any reference to their long-running D&D campaign was scrapped in favor of a more safe product to carry Carmack's revolutionary engine. This meant that the previously envisioned fantasy RPG gameplay and its matching groundbreaking gameplay mechanics went down the drain with it. In its stead, the rest of the team felt it better to match the new but challenging to work on engine with more traditional id gameplay in the form of a Doom-like game, which, with the headaches the new engine provided the team, seemed for a far safer bet. Stick with what you know, as they say. The gargantuan task of creating such a pioneering project proved to be too much for what was a crew of surely impassioned and motivated, but ultimately unprofessional bunch of gamers. I mean, these were the salad days for this recent breakthrough in PC gaming. Studios at that time weren't nearly as professional or well equipped enough for this type of revolutionary breakthrough in gaming, and a game of such a scope was going to need a much stricter regime, which Carmack, sensing the unmotivated demeanor of many of its developers, promptly implemented by way of removing the cubicles in the office and moving all desks together, so that Carmack had a direct line of sight on all of its developers. This strict regime, however, backfired as the crew previously subscribed to a work hard, play hard way of working. And while Carmack was right in thinking that this way of working wasn't going to cut it for Quake, it ended in a team of burnt out developers, which in turn resulted in tensions between its members, old and new. So, then how does a game created by a burnt out and unmotivated team like this turn out? Well, let us find out. So, we already established that Quake had some pretty big shoes to fill as the long-awaited follow-up to the smash hit that was Doom. And even though Quake got a critical reassessment in more recent times and is looked upon more favorably than at its release, it is still generally viewed as Doom's lesser but still well-loved sibling. And I love Doom, but despite it not being a grand improvement on Doom's basic FPS premise, I have to say that I might love Quake more than I do Doom. Sure, Doom was the trailblazer here, while Quake just improved on what was already there. But while Quake didn't do anything particularly innovative for the genre, I feel it perfected everything about it. And the biggest improvement here is not only in the quality of the level design, but the consistency throughout those levels. Because despite how well loved Doom is, you cannot deny that the game has as many infamous levels that are as maligned as the well-regarded ones are being praised. And I feel that for Quake, that isn't as much the case, as it has a very consistent quality throughout them. And not only is the quality more consistent along the duration of the game, but the levels itself have become more mechanically interesting now. And while you could just attribute that to a team that was by then more technically experienced in the design of levels in a 3D space, I think you shouldn't discount the effect that a groundbreaking full 3D polygonal engine had on the team's freedom to create more engaging levels. Because while the move to full 3D was an impressive visual feat for the time, it was much more impactful on the actual layouts of the level, which were now less restrictive and therefore allowed for mechanically more interesting levels. This meant you could now have floors above and below you, making for more places for the enemy to ambush you. And, as you know, it loves a good ambush, so expect plenty of those. And it's this freedom that a full polygonal engine provided that allowed them to make the levels have more of a puzzle box design. And it's this that will make for some challenging levels. Not only in its combat encounters, but in how it feels like you have to solve the level. The level being this set of interconnected switches, making things happen on the other side of the map, requiring you to navigate every corner of the level. And the best part is that this doesn't involve huge amounts of backtracking, as this was a time wherein level design didn't need to adhere to real-world logic. So they could just be these abstract but well-designed levels that are interconnected in such smart ways that the act of backtracking was rarely necessary in a level that was well designed. This combined with the at times bastard enemy placement makes for some levels that can be rather punishing, where it feels like not only the enemies want to fuck you over, but so do the levels themselves. Everything just feels engineered to work against you, to fuck you over. And this isn't a game just being plain mean to you, it's being a harsh master, teaching you to figure out how you should tackle these levels in order to succeed. And this makes it so that every level you finish feels like an accomplishment, because you didn't just blast through the levels haphazardly, strafe bombing everything in your sight. You had to be on your toes, watch out for traps, and plan strategies to take on certain encounters after a death taught you a hard lesson. It's a game that doesn't allow you to rest on your laurels. You are going to need to remain sharp during the duration of it. And it's this that makes Quake so much more engaging than most of the modern wave of boomer shooters, which take so much inspiration from it, but don't seem to be able to translate its tense combat scenarios and the vicious cat and mouse game that's being played between you and the levels themselves. And while I don't think there's anything wrong with the more twitchy style of retro shooters, I do wish that more modern boomer shooters would take inspiration from Quake's more devious and unforgiving level design. The only modern game that comes to mind that does this really is Herat, which you should play, by the way, by Herat. And in regards to what I just said about the game's level design, I would be remiss not to mention the fourth and final episode of Quake called The Elder World. This episode is basically where they dumped all the levels that were deemed too hard or punishing for the other episodes, aka the levels designed by Sandy Petersen. And as much as I hate Petersen as a person for a myriad of personal reasons, I have to admit that the game just wouldn't be the same without him. And that's even excluding the myriad of Lovecraftian influences he included that define the game's overall tone. No, it's the level design of this fourth episode, which is a huge boon to the overall feel of Quake. The most important defining factor here being that the levels in this episode were very, very mean to me. And I loved it. Yes, do it to me, Daddy Quake. Punish me. I just loved it. Because they weren't designed to be mean for mean's sake. Neither were they designed to merely punish you, but to challenge you, to push you to the edge of your abilities. Episode 4 in that regard is basically the culmination of everything that you've learned in the previous 3 episodes. The final test, if you will, to see if you were paying attention. With Quake being such a divisive game, even among its enthusiasts, it should come as no surprise that it has almost as many detractors as it has its admirers. And among the glut of criticism it regularly receives is one that keeps coming back, namely that Quake is a brown game. Yeah, I guess it sometimes is. It can also be blue, red, or grey among others. Saying that Quake is a brown game is like saying that Doom is a fire blue game. I will say though that yes, Quake is a game that employs darker tones than you'd be used to from it at that moment in time. Many of the colors used here are rather muted and not as bright as they were in Doom or Wolfenstein 3D. But it's these darker tones that make the sparse and carefully selected use of primary colors pop that much more, making for some very atmospheric and foreboding looking environments. And even though, yes, the game is much darker and muted looking than Doom was, it does however employ much more than just a brown palette as so many of its detractors claim it to do. And also, it just fits the vibe that the designers had in mind here. Doom was a way more cartoony game, and therefore that brighter palette fitted that game to a T. But here with Quake, its atmospheric setting isn't just defined by the chosen palette, it demands it. It just wouldn't feel right and believable with Doom's use of bright colors. And let's not forget that the designers had a new engine to play around with here that, for the time, could achieve a pretty realistic looking environment when compared to what came before. So for them, it must have made more sense to go with this more muted but also more realistically grounded palette. And it's this grounded look that helped the developers in exploiting one particular aspect of Doom even more in this new game. Doom was mainly a finger on the trigger and don't let go balls to the wall action game. But it also managed to have some rather atmospheric and suspenseful sections despite using an earlier rendition of a 3D-like engine. Now, the Quake engine, allowing for full polygonal levels and a crude lighting system, allowed the team to go for an even more suspenseful atmosphere. And it's here that it shows that the designers really had some fun pushing that suspenseful atmosphere to the limit. At times, you could easily describe Quake as a horror game, and you wouldn't be wrong. Horror, not by the designers immaculately planning for horror-like sequences, but by a devious combination of audio, the visuals, and more importantly, the environments and the many dangerous situations and traps it presents therein. This makes it so that instead of just circle strafing your way through the levels, you'll have to be on your toes the whole time, ready to anticipate any sort of shenanigans the level might throw at you. So it's not a feeling of horror like you would find in a typical horror movie, for instance, but horror like traversing a lion's den filled with booby traps. In these levels, there's no boogeyman to be afraid of. It's just you hoping to get out alive. It feels like it's not just the enemies populating it, but the levels themselves that are against you. The level, it hates you. And another thing that also hugely contributes to this vibe is Nine Inch Nails' Trent Reznor's moody and just plain evil sounding score to the game. The funny thing is though, when I was young, I mostly played the demo of the game, which lacked its CD audio soundtrack. But I always found it very fitting for the game regardless. Because the game had such a dark and moody horror atmosphere that I always felt that the lack of a typical heart-pumping first-person shooter soundtrack did the game huge favors in terms of amplifying its dark atmosphere. But now that I'm able to play the game with its soundtrack intact, I had to come to the conclusion that it's exactly this which Reznor's soundtrack provides. It adds the necessary audio texture to the game without ever feeling intrusive. The music is there, but due to its ambient nature, it barely registers to your ear, but unconsciously, it adds the right uncomfortable vibe to the game. Quake is a game developed by a team that was splintered, broken, and under severe time pressure. Then, when it came out, it was criticized by fans and critics alike for not offering enough innovation over its predecessor, Doom. Now, 25 years later, many, rightfully so even, see Quake as their magnum opus. And it is rather remarkable how damn good this game turned out, because under the circumstances and general bad vibe this game was developed under, this game should have been a hot stinking mess of a failure. But truly, the worst you can really say about it is that it was greatly reduced in scope from what was first promised, leaving us with a quite uninspired but very expertly designed first-person shooter that manages to improve on its legendary predecessor in each and every way. Quake, in my eyes, is truly the magnum opus of the original id team. So, that's it for me then. But remember, if you like my content, then please subscribe to the channel for future content and don't forget to give the video a like. And if you want to support the channel in growing further, then please consider donating to my Patreon for early access to my videos, lots of extra content, access to the Discord channel, and having your name appear in the credits right here. But if you don't want to be chained down by a subscription model, then you can always donate just one time on my Ko-fi, both of which are linked right down there in the description. Well, thank you so much for watching and see you all next time.